Hi, everybody. My name is Jason Henderson. I'm the publisher, one of two, publisher with my partner, Incher Yo at Castlebridge Media. And we're here on the launch day of the 11th volume of the Castle of Horror Anthology, number 11. And the topic this time was revenge. I've got a wonderful slate of authors that I'm going to get out of the way of and just act as an MC, moving from person to person. I encourage you, if you're watching this on YouTube, to put questions in the comments and let us know, what you think, and let us know if you'd like to see more of these. And if you have a question for any of the authors, I will make sure that they get them. So before we kick off, I just wanted to say, Incher is not here. My partner, who is a co-publisher, but also the designer of the cover, which you can see over my head, and all the covers of the Castle of Horror anthologies, and indeed all the covers that we do. And when we set out to do a cover for an anthology about revenge, that was a challenge, because what the heck is what is a cover that says revenge? That's actually very hard. There were a lot of shots that we looked at of models just looking shifty, looking like around a corner and what have you. And he finally struck on a cover that's essentially is fear, and the fear in the eyes of this guy. Whatever this guy did, he's he's getting his got. So if you want to know more about us, we're at castlebridgemedia.com. We do these about twice a year. I wish we could do more, but and maybe we will speed up. But right now we're hitting it at about twice a year. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go around. We usually in the pole position this time is a writer that I've worked with many times, Leanna Renee Hieber. You took the prompt and you came up with. It reminded me of Pirate Jenny, the opera, right? And actually, I can't remember what that opera is called, but anyway, the song Pirate Jenny that Lotte Lenya did. So you did Die Revanche. So can you tell us a little about that?
Absolutely. So I was traveling through the coast of southern Maine when I was doing some research for my upcoming book, which is a nonfiction about haunted history. So my debut nonfictional, Haunted History of Invisible Women, True Stories of America's Ghost, did well for Kensington, and they very quickly have contracted us for a follow-up. And so the next book is called America's Most Gothic: Haunted History Stranger Than Fiction. And I read some things about ghost ships on the coast of southern Maine. And so I was up there for a steampunk festival where I was a guest of honor. And so I used this time between my event periods to go to Wolf's Neck Preserve, where just off of these little ragged, jaggedy islands, there had been reports of a ghost ship. And it was the most uncanny experience that I've ever had on a shoreline, because one of the things I talk about in this story is that sound sounds like it's right next to you when there is no one next to you. There were people that were completely invisible to me, but I learned later they were way up the trail, like almost towards the forest, where I was at the mouth of this bay. And it sounded like they were across the bay ahead of me and also right next to me, but in fact they were behind me. It was the most disconcerting thing I ever had experienced, just acoustically. And I thought, wow, that's really a ghost story in there, because you're hearing something that you're not seeing. And the concept of this very rugged primordial landscape of weird northeast, I just imagined it covered in fog, and then this prow of a ship piercing through the fog. And so I had all of this in my head, and I started writing a chapter about ghost ships. And then I saw this call, and I thought, okay, what if the ghost ship is a revenge ship? So it just fit right in for my head about, okay, well, what is a classic sort of ghost ship narrative? What is it there for? And so the idea of it being captained by a woman who had been wronged, and she picks up fellow passengers, spirits, ghosts who have been wronged, and they, like a siren, lure murderers to their death. So it's one part siren, it's one part Flying Dutchman, sort of cursed to continue to roam the seas, but also a certain amount of like, all right, well, if you're going to do violence against me, then we're going to bring the violence back around. And it's not, it is an equal opportunity. There are many genders aboard the ship, and whoever has done a wrong will get lured to the coast. So the title Die Revanche is the German word for revenge, and everything has, you know, a sort of pronoun, and the fact that the pronoun is feminized
Mm.
for revenge made me I was
Yeah.
delighted by this, because also, of course, it looks, to the English language, it looks like die. Okay,
Yeah.
this is, you know, so I'm learning German. I'm learning German. It all fit together, and that for me also fit into that Flying Dutchman kind of narrative, and so it for me was a bit of a play on words, and something that when you accepted the story, you said something very dear, Jason. You were like, this seems like a classic story
Yeah.
that I know already, but you
Yeah.
don't. So welcome.
Well, you have that a particular way of writing that it feels like it could be the roll call of the reef. I don't remember who wrote that story, but there's a, you know, but the language was that way. I thought that was really neat, and it fit beautifully. And it also kicks you off into revenge going, okay, well, this could be any number of things. And I just had a wonderful time with it. Um, and the funny thing is, when we lay these out, I'll have a spreadsheet, and I try to make, sometimes the themes will echo one another, and sometimes they're completely different from one another. And uh, that Claire Lowe, when you turned in I Hope the Night is Quiet, it's as different from Pirates as it is from VR, which we'll get a little bit later. And it's a really frightening story. I mean, there was just something really catching and gloomy and chilling about this story. Um, Claire, talk to us about that. About what is the I Hope the Night is Quiet.
Thank you, Jason. I feel so flattered when you say it's scary. I love that. It's like being complimented at the school dance. I'm like, oh, stop. Oh, you. You
Well,
you find
it's
my
okay
story
not to.
scary? Oh,
Sometimes something's spooky, and sometimes something is moody, and sometimes it's scary. And yours was actually scary to me.
thank you. Yes, thank you. I think if you're a child, becoming afraid of the adults around you would genuinely cause a lot of terror. And the root of my story comes from something in my life that I find disturbing. Like, you'll read my story and you'll see that there's like one type of meat that's referred to, and I don't consume it. I am not a vegan. I eat every other type of meat. I'm good with meat, but this one meat does me in every time. So there's that. I Hope the Night is Quiet is a piece that was in its infancy when I just finished working on This Fresh Hell with Katya de Becerra, who's also a frequent contributor to these wonderful anthologies. And it started out almost as flash fiction. I just had about the first 700 words and thought, oh, hell yeah, I'll put this into maybe this horror podcast that I've heard about. And that did not work out. But when this call came out and Katya sent it my way, I found a way to insert revenge. Kind of as Leanna Renee mentioned, you sort of find a way to put that angle in there. And I was using the revenge angle to sort of build the terror for the children. Like they've created a kind of, the parents in this town have invented a kind of boogeyman character who's out for revenge. And they're using this supposed man with a hook to keep the children at home. And are they safe there? We don't know. So it's set in a small Australian town in which absolutely everything depends on farming this type of meat. And when a desperately severe drought sets in, a boy, the son of a butcher, begins to notice strange things.
Yeah, yeah, and it's very mysterious, and I thought it was very chilling. Do we have Dotti? Is Dotti here? I don't think so. Okay. there's
I'm here.
what? Oh, there you are. Excellent. Okay, I'm so happy. So this is way over in another in another kind of world, and it has a very strong voice. So tell me a little bit about I'll Never Understand Ghosts, and especially the voice that you chose to use in it. I mean, you know, in the same way that Leanna adopts an 18th century sort of you know, voice. What
Well, historical Gothic is my favorite genre. And so I wanted to do something along those lines. So it is Victorian. It's probably late 1800s or maybe around 1900, just, you know. And I also had the idea that I've been wanting to do a take on the Gift of the Magi, that story. So my story takes place on Christmas Eve. And it's as much of a love story as it is a horror story. But the man goes in the graveyard and he robs a grave. He gets a necklace for his wife for Christmas, and the ghost of the woman he stole it from decides to get revenge.
Yes.
And it has a twist ending because it's based on the Gift of the Magi.
Yes. Yes.
And yeah, that's basically it.
I appreciate that. It had such a you know, it has such a strong voice, and I just, to me, you know, when you're looking at a short story, there are voices that disappear and it's pure story. But a lot of times when you're choosing a short story, a particular voice, a dialect, anything like that can really make something pop.
Yeah, well, I in my head it's 1800s, or it's Victorian era England. I mean, it doesn't have to be. It has enough of a voice that it could be America, but that was what I was going for.
Yes.
And I think it comes out in the story. And I had no title for it. And then I'm typing along and you know, in my head, I had a title like Grave Secrets or some stupid thing like that. And I'm typing along and my character says, "I will never understand ghosts." And I went, "There's my title."
Yeah. Yeah. I like
So,
it. It's a comic title, and that's very cool. Thank you very
yeah.
much. So from digging in graves to exploring a mine, do you like that segue? I didn't even write that down, and yet there it was. Jeremiah Dillon Cook, you did one called The Monster in the Mine, which actually reminded me a lot. It's, first of all, it's first person present tense, which I find very difficult to write, you know, and that's to begin with. But tell me a little bit about the story and what is the nature of the revenge?
All right, so my story, The Monster in the Mine, it's about Nate. He's a teenager. He's being haunted by the ghost of his brother. His brother's ghost wants him to get revenge for his death, which he blames on a monster that lives in the town's abandoned mine.
Yeah.
His brother, the ghost, also claims that the monster causes basically all the tragedies in the town. And it was kind of interesting because after I had written the story, I realized I grew up in the 90s, big fan of Stephen King's It, the miniseries specifically. And I realized that the monster in this story is kind of like a twist on Stephen King's It. So that was kind of fun. I'm actually wearing my Dairy t-shirt today.
Yes.
So that was kind of a neat thing to realize my subconscious was doing that I didn't know I was doing as I was writing it. The town in the story is Hazel Peak, which is based off my hometown of Hazleton. That my fictional version has appeared in like 6 of my publications now, so that's kind of cool. And then I just wanted to mention, because I was thinking about inspirations for the story before this chat. There's what kind of the crux of the story is about this car accident that kills the protagonist's brother. And that was actually pretty much autobiographical to an event that happened when I was a kid. I was learning how to drive. I had my learner's permit, and my mom picked me up from school on a snowy day and was like, "Hey, are you going to drive home?" And I had a friend in the back. of the truck we were driving, and I didn't know all the best ways home, and I lived on a mountain, and so I thought, okay, I'll take the way I can think of to get home is this specific way, and it was up a giant steep road. We get about halfway up, and it's snowing and it's cold, and the car can't get up any further. So we start to like stall out on the hill. Jason, you're from Colorado. You're in Colorado. I'm sure you are familiar with this kind of thing. So we're halfway up. The car's stalled out. My mom's like, put your foot on the brake. Got my foot on the brake, and all of a sudden the pedal goes from, I don't know, here to the ground, and I'm like, oh, I don't know what just happened. My mom, I think, realized that the brakes had just snapped because it was so
Oh my
cold.
goodness.
So the car starts to roll backwards as she's getting out to come get me out. The car starts to roll backwards. My whole life flashes before my eyes. And at the bottom of the hill, this is one of the only roads in my hometown that there's no guardrail. It's just off a cliff into trees and off the mountain. So thankfully, I just jerked the wheel and managed to hit a snowbank, which was really lucky because it wasn't the snowbank, it was going to be houses on either side of the snowbank.
Yeah.
But so anyway, that whole incident is in this story, and it was really fun to get to draw on that experience. And I was just thinking about it the other day because I'm like, there's a lot of times as a kid you like have something like that happen, you almost die, and you just move on with your life. But now thinking about it, I'm like, oh my god, how did I like get through that without having any issues? But
That was really expert because I was terrified for a moment that you were going to tell us a
that I
much
actually
worse
died.
story. Like
I'm a ghost.
it is terrifying, and I had to teach 2 kids to drive around here, and it can be no fun at all. I don't know what the hell we think we're doing coming to this state, honestly, but yeah,
Mountains are tough.
yeah, yeah. Wow, thank you really quickly, you said you've done a number of stories in this universe. Do you think that you might and Scott does that too. Do you think you might gather them all together in some way at some point?
Yeah, that's actually a good setup because it's you when you responded to the story, you said it was Rob Serling-esque, which was the best compliment I think I've ever gotten as a writer. So I think if and when I do publish these stories together, I'm going to put that as the blurb on the front. Just so you, I'm not even asking permission. I'm just telling you.
Yeah. No, go crazy. Yeah, it's yeah, especially the twistiness is something that Serling and Sting, Serling and King are just so much like just American, just like what it is to be in a small town in America. There's just something of how it just drips with references and just an awareness of and I'm sure that those of you from Australia, there's got to be something similar to that, where when you look at something, you go, this is an Australian story. I mean, I can tell, so it's also really neat, by the way, whenever I see something adapted, and they'll move something that takes place in Madrid and move it to New York or vice versa. And to some extent it loses something, but also I personally think you can never get enough variations on a story. So I actually like to see it when an adaptation kind of takes something in a new direction. Will, are you here? Or do we have Will McDermott?
Yes, I'm here.
Excellent. There you are, sir. I love your shirt. That's a
thank
really
you.
good shirt. Yes, sir. So this one, Hard Sell, is a curio shop story, and which I associate with things like I think it was Vault of Horror. Anyway, whichever one had Peter Cushing in a curio shop, and I love the moment you say curio shop, you know that you can spin almost any story from it. But yours is actually about the proprietor. So tell me a little bit about Hard Sell.
Yeah, this is a strange little story. I got the prompt and started thinking, and I think I landed on the curio shop pretty quickly. It might have been the Rick and Morty episode where Summer works with the devil in a curio shop, and of course, all of the items that you sell are cursed, and they'll do the thing that the proprietor says they'll do, but they'll also curse you in some other way.
Yeah.
But the story itself, just kind of once I had come upon, hey, I'm going to do a curio shop story, kind of came to me almost fully formed. It was kind of a weird experience. I haven't experienced that very often, where I go, oh, I know what this story is. I know the shape of it. I know how it's going to go. I know what's going to happen. I know who these two characters are. And I ended up writing it. Once I had the characters kind of fleshed out, probably 2 days. I mean,
Mm.
it just flowed out of me. But yeah, it's a story. It's mostly about the proprietor, Lynott, and getting to know who he is when he has an unexpected visitor, an unexpected customer come to his shop one evening while he's having his meal, and it's the basic curio shop that is only open and only in the material plane when it appears, between two other shops that it had never been in, and someone goes, oh, look, there's a shop, let's go in, right? And he deals in revenge. That is his MO. He sells things to people who have come looking for either revenge or power or getting back at someone for something. And so this young widow comes in and she's looking for something, but he doesn't know who she is, doesn't know how she got into his shop. And so he's probing her throughout the story, trying to figure out what it is that she's looking for, what kind of revenge she's looking for, who she's looking to get revenge upon. And so there's a bit of a mystery on both sides, and the conversation between the two of them is almost a dance. It kind of goes back and forth. It ebbs and flows. Who has more power and who has less power? At one point, Lynott feels like he's out of his element and retreats back behind his cash register where he feels more confident and starts taking more control. I won't really go into more than that.
No, yeah.
Other than to say that the items that I sprinkle through this curio shop, some of them are things that I had looked up previously. I've written some Kolchak stories, and so the Hand of Glory was something I'd used in a Kolchak novel, and so I'd done some research on these kind of cursed items before, and so yeah, I sprinkled a bunch throughout, and they do play a part more than just being pretty trinkets on the tables as she's wandering around the shop.
I love the idea of a shop that's because there's all these traditions. Like I remember there's an old Japanese folk tale about a temple that's not actually there, but the scholar finds his way to it in the middle of the night. And I've seen that story 1,000 times, but I
Right.
always love it. I always love that the haunted house that isn't there, and I love those elements. I actually, when we're done going around, I want to ask you guys if what he said actually bears true for a lot of you guys, where you come up with an idea and sometimes the story just flows and sort of comes around right away. Thank you, Will. All right, Sara. So that was, all of these have, except for the Claire's story, which is rural, most of these have taken place in kind of a place that's alien to us in time. But yours is cyberspace. Yours is really very, very forward-looking, very, very futuristic. Can you tell me a little bit about unauthorized access?
Yeah, I've always been a big fan of cyberpunk, altered carbon, Black Mirror, the intersection of morality and technology. I actually already had this story mostly finished before we met at Colorado Festival of Horror. And when you told me about the anthology, I'm like, I have something for that. It was.
I'm so excited thank you for making that connection, because I had forgotten that was where we met, was the Colorado Festival of Horror. That is
Yes.
awesome. Anyway, yes.
So the whole story pretty much came from the first scene. As cliche as it was kind of a dream I had of this man stalking this woman, and he does terrible things to her. And so then I put myself in the shoes of, if that happened to me, how would I want to respond? And if you have this technology at your disposal, and again, is very cyberpunk, a lot of it happens in virtual reality. There's, for the majority of the story, there's little physical violence, but it's how do our bodies, how do our minds react to this kind of trauma, and do we go too far? And if we're taking our revenge is a lot of the theme of the story.
It also kind of grapples with this notion of, is a fantasy sin still a sin? Like, if I feel like if I feel, which is something that I think a lot of us grapple with, this notion of, is the stuff that you do online real? Is the stuff that you read real in your brain? And I'm just fascinated by the fact that there could be a moral kickback to the stuff that you think that you're doing just for entertainment. Thank you very much. So Scott, Scott Pearson, First Impression is a bloody ass story, man. It is. It's an assassin story, where Sarah's is futuristic. Yours feels like it could be happening at a bar at the Marriott right now.
Yeah.
Talk to me about First Impression.
Well, this is a first for me in contributing to Castle of Horror, in that this is a reprint. When I got the prompt for Revenge, this was a story of mine that immediately came to mind. I had printed this, I had self-published this in a small collection of 4 short crime stories. The interesting thing about this story is the very bare bones kernel of the story, the idea of someone who endeavors to not make any impression, literal or metaphorical.
Yeah.
I had jotted that down as an idea at least 10 years ago or more. And it just sat, in the little word file of ideas that you gather. And then when I was putting together some this self-published collection of some crime stories that also pre-existed, I wonder if there's anything else that I have in my notes. And I went back through my notes, stumbled across this thing about First Impression. And at that moment, somehow the assassin thing came to me that hadn't been a part of the first idea, just the impression that you leave on a piece of paper when you write on.
Yeah.
And so then I just started working on it, and this really grim little story came out of me. And I'd never really written a lot of straight crime fiction before, but I always like experimenting with different genres. Previously, the sort of crime-related stories I've written have been sort of comedic mystery things, wisecracking mysteries. But yeah, this one came out very dark. I was a little concerned. I asked you about it because I was a little concerned that it would be too dark even. Because somehow, real life horrors can be scarier than supernatural stuff. And this one is so real that there's aspects of it that creeped me out while I was writing it.
I can imagine.
But luckily, you said it wasn't too dark.
No, we were able to go pretty dark, and I have to say, I've read the stories in our LGBTQ collection that's coming later in the year, and it goes darker by half. I mean, it is like so I am thinking more and more about trigger warnings as we go along, but I was really happy with it, and I loved the character study of this gentleman who. It's almost like a hobby to see how little of an impression he can make on people. Every word he says, every sentence he says to somebody is calculated in a chess game in his head about what is the thing he can say that will leave the least memory that he was there. I had never encountered that before, and that's neat. I really would love. Well, except for I can think of an assassin. This is airport fiction, but The Firm. There's an assassin in there where Grisham says that he was a man who left no impression or something like that. So there's, but it's rare, and it's a really cool motif. So thank you very much. I like that a lot. Rob Nisbet is not with us because he's on the other side of the globe. But if you have a chance to check it out, The Return of the Invisible Man is a H.G. Wells pastiche, and it reads like Wells. I mean, it's really wild. It really does. Just the fastidious, slightly over vocabularized language that H.G. Wells would use. It's neat, and I was just super impressed by that. Although it has a modern structure, which I thought was cool. Like if you were to set out, Leanna, I'm sure you think about this all the time with 18th century writers. If you were to set out to write a Bronte story, you probably wouldn't structure it like a Bronte story, because where the hell is the structure? I mean that so yeah, I love that as modern writers, you guys will take these things and put them into a modern structure. All right, so Serena, you have another story that is futuristic. I'm just so fascinated. Tell me, Serena, and when we come around again, let's talk about SF versus today. But this is a really neat story about VR vacations. In a way, it's like we can remember it for you wholesale. So tell me a little bit about the story, Future Perfect, and whatever you like.
Well, I kind of came up with the idea because I was watching a lot of a German series called Dark. And it's one of those things where there's multiple timelines, it's in another language, it's fantastic. But you have to pay such close attention to it. You can't multitask or anything, and it messes with your mind. And so after watching a bunch of that, there's nothing in common with my story, but that got my mind moving on different scenarios. So my story is about someone who's the other woman in a relationship. And she works for a company where they look at possible futures based on choices. So in walks the wife of the guy she's seeing, and she's looking at whether she should carry a baby, whether she should have a surrogate or adopt a baby. And each choice comes with different consequences. So I really want to do it from a character who most people, it's not the good person. It's that person who, does the bad thing. And, the revenge is kind of interesting how that all rolls out. I won't spoil anything, but yeah, I really wanted to look at that opportunity where her choices, what she does in the moment, and how it affects the story.
Without commenting on where the story goes, I think it's one of the interesting revenges of winding up with somebody else's spouse is that you're then stuck with that person. And it's such an interesting revenge in itself, is that the revenge is that life just moves forward. Happy endings are a revenge in a sense. That's so thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. And it's so modern. I mean, it feels very real, and it was just so neat to have just straight up sci-fi. We don't have Katya, which is, bless her heart, she's very busy. But her story is to die like a pharaoh, and it's almost a dark adventure about these women that find themselves in, without giving too much away, they find themselves in a tomb left by somebody that they think they know. They figure out why they're all there, and then they have to figure out how to get out. And it's really neat. It's told in a first person plural, which is interesting. Like and then we came to the end, and I was just really impressed by that. It was very neat. Anyway, you should check that out. So that gets us to Carmen. Now, Carmen, your story was about a woman who is a worker who's being taken advantage of, and she makes an alliance, and the story is called The Suicide Tree. And I wondered, first of all, how did you choose these main characters? Like, what were you thinking of?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for having me. I love being a part of this. Hi, Leanna and Dotti, I remember you. Also, thank you. My mom and dad are here listening to all these horror writers, and I'm just so grateful that they were willing to join and be fans for us.
Thank you, Mom and Dad.
Yeah, mine are there too.
Yay, that's wonderful.
Yay!
Gay teen parents
Yay!
going to darker places than we even want them to go, but they
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
All right. So actually kind of in the same vein as Leanna and Dotti, I love the gothic women's, the monsters from that time period because they're really weird and kind of reflect on societal morals from that time period. So I wanted to weave that in to my modern day character, and that's why my protagonist, I also wanted her to be an older woman. I wanted her to be in her 50s because they're often invisible, right? So she's basically working at a cleaning agency. She's come over from Mexico. She's been here and she's been cleaning, and she's really not making very much cleaning wealthy people's homes. And she happens to find this woman who she cleans for, and this woman is getting her PhD and women's studies from the Victorian era. And so she starts to learn about these monsters, and the revenge is that she's got this horrible boss who he actually has killed her friend that she doesn't even realize. And so I guess I just wanted to kind of bring all those elements together and have this woman have revenge on this awful guy and learn about monsters from that time period as well. And this woman basically comes along and saves her. So
yeah. It's so funny. I love the horror aspect of this, but I also really love the idea of shedding a light on the kind of exploitation that can happen for workers like this character. And my wife is an immigration attorney, so my first thought I was reading this was, oh, this woman needs a T visa. I mean, there's actually an opportunity. Like, if she could get herself to an attorney, there's actually a good chance she could get a green card. But but also revenge is good. That's also good. But yes, thank you very much. I really enjoyed that, and it was just a very pleasant. I know it's a deathly story, but I thought it was a lovely story, and I liked their friendship.
right. And I also wanted to, I guess the other part of it is because this woman's studying Victorian time period, that's how she comes up with this whole idea of the plants that she's studying that
Yeah.
are poisonous. But anyhow, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, absolutely, and thank you. Michael, Joseph, Tharnish, Roby, or Robbie.
Hey,
How do
you got it
pronounce
on the
it?
first try.
Thank you. So, this is a very particularly Irish story, and it's as different from the TVs and needing migrant workers as you could possibly get, because we're in the world of fairy. So, and it has in common with Scott. It's a bloody story, man. So what? Talk to me about Small Retributions.
So Small Retributions was it was a culmination of a couple of older stories I'd kind of come up with and written out that I kind of reformulated into something new. I think of myself, I do really love writing horror, but I always think of myself as a fantasy writer first and foremost. And so I really like that element of like magical creatures, and they have like specific limitations. They can do magic, but like they're bound by certain like laws of nature. At one point, my protagonist, who is a fae, he flat out says, "I can as much lie as you can fly." He says that to a human because like he's physically incapable. So I really like that element. I really like this was kind of the second piece I've done that I would call xenofiction, which is told from a non-human perspective. At one point, I wrote a story about an owl who was being pursued by a bobcat, and so I was kind of pulling from that a little bit. And then there was and then like when I was thinking about, all right, what kind of like revenge element do I want to have here? I kind of thought I liked the idea of the protagonist obviously to the reader has nothing to do with what's going on.
Yeah.
But like the villain of the piece is prejudicial, and he thinks all Fae kind is bad because he believes one has kidnapped his child and left some deformed other alternative in its place. I've written one or two stories about the Polish version of that. Those creatures are called Odmiants. In the Irish version, they call them changelings. They're swapped, you know, when you're a child for a fairy child, and then like in the story, you have to beat the fairy child until its parent takes pity on it and wants to trade you back. And I kind of liked the idea of, okay, so what if we had that setup, and then the setup of the parent never comes back for one reason or another? Is this child just trapped in this situation? And show how it kind of escalates, gets worse. Show a protagonist who again has nothing to do with this story. He's just, you know, he's just one more proxy for all Fae kind. He's one more person who might know the person that the father in this case needs to take revenge on. And so, you know, he's kind of serving as a proxy for his people. And eventually, you know, he attempts to turn it around. I won't give too much away, but there's different elements of that. So I like kind of the folklore there. I like the magic there. And then there was just that real reality that, like, I was kind of thinking about what I think are kind of the worst kinds of people. And I think like the consensus has become that like the old folklore stories of the Fae who trade out your child for another, well, that was kind of the magical at the time pre-genetic explanation for, you know, if your child looked nothing like you, potentially because your spouse had an affair, or because they had a physical affliction that had nothing to do with them. Not to I'm potentially giving some stuff away on the plot itself. But I remember when I think about kind of the worst kinds of people, I have this distinct memory of there was this old documentary, this mini documentary that was made about these children with special needs, and this woman looked dead into the camera and talked about how strongly she considered driving her car into the lake with her challenged child in the back seat and just drowning the both of them. And she's saying that with this kid in the room. And I'm like, this is one of the worst kinds of people I could ever possibly imagine. And so like I've done a couple of different stories of the changeling being traded out, the parent and the child in the room. And it's like, even in the most fantastical circumstances, even supposing that there was, you know, a big trade made there and all that, that kid has nothing to do with it. That's circumstances of birth. And, you know, we're back to that point, having nothing to do with anything. And I just was like, it gets such a visceral reaction out of me. And I was like, that's an interesting, I like that angle. And I thought it would make for a good story that eventually leads to some sense of kind of the cyclic nature of revenge. So
absolutely. And it is a hard horror story. And there was a really bloody Max Brand story from like the 30s that I remember having this kind of the texture, like one of the, like everybody has something that they tend to lean on in, because you don't have many words in a short story. And with this one, there is texture, just like a feeling of crampedness and dustiness and oiliness, and it really drips. And it's that is if we come, I might ask you guys later about your thoughts on texture and voice if we get a chance. But thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
We don't have Charles, so that's okay. Charles did another fantasy story in his world of his immortal character Carmen, which was a delightful sort of palate cleanser after you, Mr. Roby, and I. But I'm sorry that we don't have Charles tonight. But he's a great guy, and you got to check out his story. It's called The Terrors of the Grave, which sounds like something in an EC comic. But Melanie, we do have Melanie. I thought I saw. There you are. Yes.
Yes.
Melanie. This is another very grisly story. But what really struck me though also is how grounded in just pure rage against abuse and violence it was. you know, you know what, you could talk about that better than me, but I did say that I if you can say you enjoyed it, I enjoyed seeing this woman who's sort of a vengeful Wonder Woman in a very bloody world. So tell me about Severed Cape. Severed Cape, even the title.
Yeah.
Is, what is
Well,
it?
to be honest, that reaction from you is honestly exactly what I hope most readers will feel. And like something I've said to a few friends is I think this story will only haunt and hopefully properly haunt a very certain type of person. But I would like to hope that it will feel like justice to most people who read it. So like I'm quite new to horror writing, but yeah, like got to shout out Katya, our horror mama, because yeah, she kind of encouraged me to spread my little spooky wings and write this. And yeah, I just kind of sat with that theme of revenge and I just kind of thought about it for a moment and I was like, what is it? Like, what is it that truly boils like my blood? And it came to me quite easily. I happened to be watching, I'm a big fan of like cult docos. Happened to be watching Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey. And it kind of just was the pinnacle of rage that had been, yeah, growing my whole life, really, at all the horrible stories I've heard. And I agree, someone said earlier, like, for me, a lot of the most scariest horrors are the real life, you know? And yeah, so she was born, Severed Cape was born in all her gory glory. And yeah, it's funny, like thinking, just reflecting on like some of what brought me to writing that. I actually like remember hearing like sweet little mamas that you'd never expect say, can I swear? Can I curse on here? Saying we should like he should have his dick ripped off from crimes like that. You know, and when you hear like a sweet little mama exclaim something like that, even as a child, you start to understand that it's a very, like even very little, and you're like, what are they talking about, you know? But as you get older, you realize it's very real and it's very, yeah, there. Once I allowed myself to properly feel that rage, and like, especially women, I think historically have been very much silenced and encouraged to be silent about this stuff. And yeah. So this story was born, my anti-hero Wonder Woman who who attacks predators and rips off their penises and fingers and makes a cape out of it. So there you go. She was born.
There's a scene where she sees these guys who are giving this girl in a bar a hard time, and I think one of the interesting things that I probably wouldn't have thought to write, you know, it's not the first thing that, and that's why I want voices that aren't mine, where she says she can tell that this woman is beginning to feel uncomfortable with these men, but she's continuing to smile, continuing to be polite, because it's like her only defense really is to be polite. And that's such a shitty way. You know, that's just something that I all I can observe is that's terrible. But it was very well. It was really interesting to see into it. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for cheering for me for that story. Because yeah, like I think when I wrote it, it's definitely the darkest thing I've ever written. And initially you're like, can I? Like, do I want to go there? And like, is it too much? And I think I even say that in the story. And then I'm like, no, it's never enough. Like if you see like the impact that it has on people's lives and like the sheer volume is just overwhelming, you know, like when you hear people's stories and like it's, yeah. So it was, I think every time I hear like another story that makes me want to scream, I remember I wrote this and it gives me like a weird sense of calm because sometimes that justice is not served. Sometimes people have to live in silence from like horrific things for whatever reason. And yeah, like I'm not under any delusions that this story is going to change like that. But yeah, I wrote it to feel this sense of like justice at these horrors. So yeah, thank you for seeing something in it. And yeah.
I'm glad it's there. It reminds me of how Superman, for instance, was invented to be sort of a champion for the working man. And you know, there'd be this notion that even if it's not in real life, there's this imaginary champion that can make us feel a little bit better because he's beating up the KKK and beating up the mob bosses and so forth.
Yeah.
It's very like that, only it's for women and bloodier. Okay, so Heath Heath Shelby. The funny thing is that again, you read Severed Cape and you're like, ooh, and then the funny thing about the clowning is this is a story that I thought seemed like a Charlton horror comic. It seemed like something out of like Tales of the Unexpected or something like that, because it even down to there's a circus that comes to town and there's a reason for revenge and involves a bunch of jerk ass teenagers. So you know, and again, we were verging into Stephen King territory just because of just his creative lock on small towns. But tell me about what the heck the clowning is.
Well, first off, thanks for the compliment for the Charlton comics. I love those, and I think when you first talked to me about this, you mentioned King and Kuntz, and that's like the greatest compliment ever. But I like to set this story, this little small town Arkansas universe I'm creating. But this is probably, you may find surprising after reading it, most personal thing I've written, and also it's very loosely based on a true story. I wrote this story. It was originally part of a much bigger project. And I hope to go back and finish that project later. But when you made the prompt for this, I thought I've got the perfect revenge story. I've got the motive. I've got the protagonist, the antagonist. I got everything right here. And so I made a more condensed version of that. I wrote this for my daughter. One of the things that we bond over, my kids, my son Colin, my daughter Colin's always been horror. We love horror movies, horror video games. But when it comes to horror fiction, my son reads it, but my daughter, she does not like to read, and she has dyslexia. So, of all the things I've had published, she's never read a single word. Just doesn't like to read. Even though she's been written in as characters, she's never read a single thing I've written. So we were watching, I think, Hell House LLC Origins one night, watching creepy clown movies. And she mentions how she just cannot stand clowns. And she starts telling me these stories. If you remember back in 2016, there were these clowns showing up around the country, around the world, just standing on sidewalks, waving at people, just being creepy clowns. So she was telling me these real stories of her and her friends, teenage girls, encountering clowns in our small town and around the town. They would be out in the pasture waving at them. They'd be chasing down a dirt road, knocking on the door, looking through the peephole. And so these kind of played into the story I was already working on. I thought, you know, I can make something better out of this. I can make a condensed, more a violent story, in fact. And so I just kind of put that in the blender of my mind and just mixed it up. And I've always been fascinated by my circuses, and I thought this is a great way to make this story happen. Bring the small town circus town. They come to town every year. They know some of the people in town, and then, like you said, there's some jerk ass kids. We call them rednecks. We have rednecks that roll in, and they cause some problems. And the problem they cause involves a loss of a baby, a miscarriage. And so the mother, and it's never really stated that she's of Romanian descent, anything like that, but you get the idea that's what it is. And she placed this curse on this town until justice is served, the curse will live on. And the curse just takes the form of sadistic, supernatural killer clowns. Hence the name, The Clowning.
Yes. I love it. And it's so again, it's so EC and just like it's another super violent picture. It's so interesting to go from some of these things which are very thoughtful and I'm not saying your story is not thoughtful, but it is deliberately drawn in a certain way, right? And to go from some of these things that are pure mood to something that is pure viscera, right? It is a visceral, hard driving story from beginning to end, and I really enjoyed that. I'm glad.
I thank you for giving me this opportunity to write this story, because my daughter told me that this is one that she'll read. So for my dyslexic daughter to read something I've written, that's the personal part of it. So I'm really thrilled about that. I can't wait to hear her opinion of how her friends come out in this story.
Oh, I'll bet. I want to hear too how how that works out. Yeah, I mean, I like, by the way, the multiple points of view, the moving around from character to character into the sheriff and the sheriff and his good old boys who are all connected to the teens, you know, the kind of thing that you can only have in a small town. If
Right.
you were putting something in as a writer, if you were putting something in a city, you'd have to still invent a small town inside it, like inside a university or inside a company or whatever. But yes, thank you very much. I don't know if we have Bryan. Is Bryan here? I don't think we have Bryan. Well, if not, Bryan's is a daring story called Justified, and he takes on just the fantasy of getting revenge on police officers who have gotten away with crimes. And you know, this is the place. This is the place to do that. To think of these revenges. I would let him talk about it, but it's a very, very well done story. And likewise, Alethea is chasing tornadoes right now. Alethea Kontis. So she couldn't be with us. She is just a delight to work with, and she's really great. And her story is another sort of not futuristic, but highly technological story using using nanotechnology and a sort of a brilliant capitalist woman who's become super rich and has access to technology, and she uses it at her high school reunion to get revenge, which is just a wonderful fantasy. Is Liz here? Liz? I don't know if we have Liz. Well, if not, that's and I think Liz is overseas as well. So someday we'll have to figure out a way to time these so that everybody overseas can join us. But hers was a very interesting story, just a very personal telling of an abusive relationship and a woman who's trapped in a time loop in it. And it's a painful story. It is very painful and very, very well told. It has a beautiful voice, and I was really, really very moved by it. So if you guys have time to stick around, I'd like to ask you some questions just about writing. Would that be all right? I mean, if you have to go, I know that we're at the top of the hour, but I'd love to sort of get some of your thoughts. So, and if you do have to go, I'm so thankful that you're here, and I'm thankful for all of you. It's a great honor for me and for Entry to get to work with you and get to bring voices out. So, but I want to ask you. So, Carmen, are you taking off? Okay. Thank you very much, and I'll talk to you really soon. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Enjoy. I've got to go to bed and teach students tomorrow writing.
Understood. Well, cool. Well, you can tell them about this and see if they have any questions to put on the YouTube when we put it up. Unless you don't want them to know, in which case.
No, not yet. Maybe in 10 years.
Right. Okay. Excellent.
Bye.
Bye. I'm really curious. Do your short stories, when you sit down to write one, do they tend to just flow? Do you work on it for months on end, or do you just like, or did they just come out and like I've often like said I'll write a whole story over a weekend, but not always. I'm just curious if anybody wants to share anything, that'd be great.
Mine definitely.
It depends on the story.
Yeah.
Yeah, some come easy, and I've got a project I'm working on now that I've just been struggling with over and over for the last year or two, and I just cannot, you know, every draft is a little bit better, but it never quite seems to get there.
So sometimes like I have a file over there of stories I started 20 years ago, and I don't even know what's in there, but I'm sure that some of it will be good. Leanna?
Definitely. It's with the Revanche that absolutely just it I knew exactly where it wanted to go. It knew exactly where it wanted to go. And the setting was so palpable for me. That's the key for me. If I have a good setting, everything else will fall into place. I need the setting and I need the character. And so to have this domineering captain figure and then this sort of protege figure, those two were very clear in my mind, and everything else was sort of circumstance. So for me, setting and the anchor characters, if I have those, I'm really off to the races. And I do have a funny story about merging what you said earlier about the Brontes and like merging a historical voice with a modern audience. My favorite rejection letter for my debut novel, which was Strange and Beautiful, set in 1888 London. My favorite rejection letter was from Kensington, who is now my publisher at the time, who said, "It's a little too Victorian." Thanks. I said it in 1888, but what they meant was the pacing and the density was too Victorian. And so I have to split the difference between what a Bronte or Henry James or Edgar Allan Poe would sound like and what a modern editor will accept. And so I'm really trying to kind of like just pull and evoke the Victorian era, while still having a modern sensibility that I can't have, too many paragraph long sentences.
Yeah. Well, certainly, there's sentences and sentence structure and voice, but also just structure. I mean, for instance, when I think of Claire's story and Heath's story, they are almost not necessarily in length, but they're structured kind of like novellas or even a novel, just sort of shrunk down, because there's multiple scenes, and that's daring, because what always strikes me is I can never decide, because I write mostly novels, I don't know how to structure a short story personally. It's very hard for me to go, well, should it be a vignette where it's basically just one scene that kind of goes from beginning to end, like they're on a stage, or but if I start going, okay, here's sort of the first act, and then eventually all of a sudden I've got something that's 20,000 words and it's not a short story anymore. And do you guys have any thoughts about that? Like, can you tell me how the hell to sit down and write a short story? Like, does that question make any sense?
I think you should just write the ending, and that's your story. That's how you get a short story a lot of times. Just write that climax, the last 3,000 words, and then there you go, short story. I don't know. I wish I had your problem. I wish I could just write 20,000 words on accident. I wrote a novella back in November, and I'm still struggling with it because it's just, I don't like writing long. I like to, like you said earlier, I sit down at a chair on a weekend or on a Saturday and I write all day, and then I have a short story, and I love it. It's easy. It's wonderful. I've gotten a little lazy about writing long now, so I'd love to get back into that space.
I have to agree with what Jeremiah said. Like you said as well, it's hard to condense something down. If you wrote it originally to be a novel, like this story I wrote, most of the ones I write, I get the ending first. That I know where I want to go. And I'm just letting it flow. But then you got to cut those parts out if you're making a short story, because you're fleshing out too much. And this one was the most difficult thing I had written, because I wrote it to be a novel. And so I left a lot of those acts out of it and just try to make it flow a little better. And like you said, it kind of jumps from character to character because I could really flesh that out. So I get the ending first, but this time I didn't get the ending first. I did all that and kind of found a new ending.
Oh, interesting. Claire,
I kind of come from a similar place in terms of I always have the instinct to write long, and kind of have I don't know. It always used to be my instinct to go long. I didn't used to think I could do short at all. I spent a couple of years writing for Jeremiah's website, actually, to plug him a little bit, and he does short form submissions on there, and that's where I really kind of cut my teeth on doing kind of smaller, more episodic stories. And once I started doing that, it became a matter of, okay, figure out a story that kind of feels like it just runs over a relatively short time scale. And then, like, it feels like it's it becomes a matter of trying to just write one chapter that feels like it gets everything you need to get done in a whole full-length text, which sounds pretty arduous, but I come from the theater, I come from one-act plays and all of that business, so there is an art to being able to kind of condense and pick a small frame of something and just produce off of that. With that said, I have a 7,000 word short story that does have multiple scenes right now. It's kind of it's my kind of sinister follow-up to Peter Pan, being considered for a different anthology. And by the time I was done with that, I was like, oh geez, I hope the publisher likes it, because boy, am I sitting here like, this should have been a full length thing. This went on. This is too condensed. This demanded a Peter Pan length novella, not
Yeah.
this little 7,000 thing I got here. But we'll see what that publisher thinks.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, for me, Jason gave me my ending actually, because I pitched to him with my initial 700 words, and Jason
I forgot
was
about that.
finding out with it, but he said your protagonist has to get away in the end. And I was like, great, because otherwise, when I'm writing, I don't know where I'm going. Just like in life with a map, I don't know where I'm going. I have no sense of direction. I was having dinner with a friend and he was like, you don't know what's going to happen in your story? And I was like, I don't know, dude. Like, listen, I don't know.
I just
I
write the
forget
thing.
which writer it was who said that you can sort of see no further than your headlights, but you can drive the whole way.
Huh.
And I think that's fine. I feel like I'm a person who's, my mind is cooking something up. And I feel like a person, I think I've said, who's like dislodging nightmares from my brain. And
Yeah.
it's weird. It's like recalling last night's dream. There's words in there, and I'm gonna find them. Mostly they're gonna occur to me when I'm in the bath, and it's going to be a bit weird. I wish I could just do, I think, what Jeremiah Dylan Cook said, which was like, we can blip blop bloop story. I think mine's a lot more like, oh that, oh God, oh.
Yeah.
It's
I
not
found
always
that
that
working with
easy, but it is a lot of times, but not always.
You're
Sometimes
making it
does take
sound
a while.
awesome, but I thank you
Yeah.
for saying I have a novella kind of style. I find novels so much harder because controlling the weird things are falling out of my brain feeling is a lot harder to sustain over 80,000 words.
It
That's
is
how I
hard.
ended up with the guy you saw walking just now giving me water. He's a lawyer and he was reading an early draft and he was like, listen, your seasons don't run in the right order. And I was like, huh.
I hadn't thought of
And
I don't know if this is, I feel like a lot of people probably know this, but in case they haven't, like, so I use something called a beat sheet for pretty much every project I work on now, because yeah, I tend to have, like, as well, I think a lot of us just have a melting pot of ideas. And even though I hate like formulaic writing, I hate to be able to predict what's going to happen next. This simple beat sheet that another writer gave me many years ago now, it kind of just helps me think about my character and like align and put their stakes, what's driving them through the story. So I tend to map out those like key character stakes, and then I'll give myself creative freedom completely outside of that, because any other plotting outside of that, just it's not for me. it hurts my head. But this one, I'll literally send it to anyone who needs something like that, because yeah, it's a really easy one single sheet, just helps me get the story cooking where I want it to go, instead of just being a melting mess of ideas, which is what it would be if I just let it rain.
what's the beat sheet called?
It's the beat sheet. I think it's from Save the Cat, possibly,
Yeah.
like the key plot points.
It may well
But
be.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've taught when I teach for the Horror Writers of America, I usually start with Save the Cat, acknowledging, of course, that Save the Cat is really almost identical to Sid Field's 3-act structure, just with different words, and that's fine. But the point is, it can be useful, for me anyway, to have a spreadsheet, and I'll print it out. I'll print out a blank sort of table, and I'll take it outside, and I'll start filling in sort of the beginning and the middle and the end. And that's my only way of doing it. But yeah, thank you very much. There's something else I was thinking about, which is, and I don't, just say, somebody share whatever you want, because I'm not quite sure what the answer is, but I find that some stories rely heavily on texture, some choose to lean heavily on voice, and some are very much plot driven. But how do you choose? Because not every writer is going to write exactly the same every time. But like I mentioned with Michael's story, it's very textury. It's very glistening and gloppy and just
For
so,
me, I just sit down and it just falls out of my head.
so
My
you're not
story,
thinking
I
in
sat
terms of
down.
let's lean
I
heavy
didn't
on.
even know what I was doing. I just sat down and it just writes itself. I'm really lucky with some things, not everything, but for that one, it just sort of, I didn't think about, well, I did think about voice once I started writing it because I wanted it to have a historical
Yes.
Victorian voice, but I just sat down and it just the words just poured out. I was really lucky with that one. So I didn't give a lot of thought to, and I'm more right brained, so I can't do beat sheets and plotting and outline. I'm just a straight up pantster, and that's that's the way I write everything. Occasionally, I mean, most of the time I know where the ending's going, and I have to occasionally stop and think, well, this really needs to happen before that happens. But I'm just straight right brain. It just is in there and just comes out once I'm in the act of writing. I can't plot because I cannot think of what comes next unless I'm in the act of writing.
Does
So
anybody else do that where you really well, it's sort of like what Claire was saying, how you don't really know where you're going. Does anybody else just pants it?
That's how I started. It's how I
Good.
started, but my editors won't let me do that anymore.
I think I come from a very different background because I primarily started with game writing for role-playing games. So I have to have a plot to start with, the bare bones of A, B, C, this happens, and then build on from there. And that's how I approach a lot of my writing. And I even work on microfiction sometimes of just what is the absolute bare minimum this needs to have to be a story. And yes, you can build on it from there. But then, it has to be cohesive to start with.
I usually have sort of the vague idea of the beginning, middle, and end, but then there's still a lot of room for discovery because you don't want to overthink it beforehand. You want to be able to have those surprises that seem to come out of nowhere or come out of your character just on their own. And with first impression, I feel that was something that was very character driven, where I just had this sort of idea to start with, and I'm kind of getting in the head of this cold-blooded assassin, and then just kind of saw where it took me.
Yeah.
But other times, especially if you're working on a longer piece, then I will sometimes have some sort of outline, not super organized, but maybe just a quick list of here are these certain points that I know have to happen to make this hold together over, if it's 10,000 words, 20,000 words or longer. But something that's going to be under 10,000, it's a lot easier to pants it and see where it takes you, because if something goes wrong, you're not throwing out 15 pages of stuff to get back to get back on track.
That's what I love about the beat sheet. I rarely stick to my original plan. It's just like to kind of get the cogs turning. And I think for me, aside from that, I'm just such a pantser. And I think it's Margaret Atwood who says it best. And she's like, there's only one rule when it comes to writing, and that's hold my attention. And I kind of always have that line in my head when I'm writing. I'm just like, am I hanging on the edge? Do I want to know what happens next? Do I care about the next line? So in terms of like what comes next, character, texture, what you ask, Jason, that's kind of how I decide. I'm like, am I bored? Have I over-described? Like, do I still give a shit about this character? And if the answer's no, I change it.
That's interesting. Yeah.
I think I definitely used to do a lot more pantsing than I do anymore. It just didn't feel like it was, I reached a certain point where it didn't feel like it was working as well for me in the macro sense. Now, when I'm writing kind of in the micro sense, if I'm writing in a scene, if the scene, like how I know, how I think I know a scene's going really well is when like it just starts flooding out of me and I'm writing without even thinking about it. And oftentimes I do write stuff that kind of surprises even me when I do it. And that's, that's when I feel like I'm doing my best work. But on the macro sense, I do a lot more planning these days. But when I get to individual scenes, there's still opportunities for it to take me by surprise. And briefly, since I got name dropped with the texture question in that business, just knowing that this was going to be a shorter thing, like I love plenty of psychological horror stories in that business, but it feels like they inherently require quite a bit more time and page count commitment. Whereas to compare it, EC Comics has come up, Charleston Comics has come up. My favorite of those old classics is actually the old Creepy comics, and
Yeah.
those lasted like 3 pages tops a lot of the time. And
Yeah.
I just like went back to those mental images of like, the guy who at the ending twist as he was dead all along, he's like kind of pulling his face off, and there's all this ichor and all that underneath, and I'm like, that gets an instant visceral reaction. That's a lot of fun. I like that, and I really like horror movies and whatnot, where you can really kind of revel in how kind of there's a lot of nastiness around. I love the giant scenes of blood flying everywhere in Evil Dead 2. And Bruce Campbell says that he could break that shirt in half because it was so saturated with corn
Yeah.
syrup. And I think like that's, if you've got the time and if you've got the words and you got the page count, like psychological horror is wonderful and it's great, and I'm sure plenty of people can do it in not very many words. But since I didn't feel like I could, it kind of felt like, well, then we'll get there by we'll just make it very physical, lots of
Yeah.
reaction to things. And the fact that it's a fae means like, I can literally talk about he touched iron and like the iron burns his skin, the salt like starts making stuff boil. And like I said, I like those rules. I like magic stuff because there's a lot of time there's like special rules that have to be abided to there. And so that's, I don't know, those work great for inspiration, I felt like.
That's wonderful. Yeah. Does anybody else have a question or anything that you'd like to discuss just about your process or about anybody else's process or
I don't have a question, but I forgot to tell you, Joy Preble texted me this morning to say happy pub day.
Oh, that's so nice. That is really
Yeah,
nice. I'm really
because I
glad.
know she told me I'm not going to be in this one, but
No,
but
it
I
was,
thought you'd like to know that.
no, she was wonderful to work with. So yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
My question is, can I see the cat?
What I don't have a cat. Wait, who's got a cat?
There's a Desi D cat that keeps on appearing.
Yes. Wonderful.
Oh, beautiful. All right.
It's your co-host, Desi. That's really great.
My cat's usually sitting in this chair that I'm in right now, and she's kind of resentful towards me about it, so she's staying away.
My dogs are mad that I've kicked them out of the office for tonight. So yeah.
What about you, Jason? What was your favorite part about working on this one? Number 11, was it different to the other ones or
Always different? It's always different. I mean, we always have a few familiar faces and we often have new people. And so it's neat to discover sort of where different people are going to go because the order, the prompt is usually not very detailed, giving people a lot of room to play. But one thing that really struck me as I was going through this is that everybody has some kind of fantasy of revenge. And it was Incher's idea. Like Incher was the one who came up with, hey, let's do something about revenge. And I was just fascinated by the fact that could come to people's minds in so many different ways. And they were all valid. And by valid, what I'm talking about is one thing we don't grapple with is revenge okay? Like, is it okay to get revenge? And in fiction, you can go ahead and do revenge, and get away with it. Yours is one of the ones where revenge is taking a toll on the person getting it. you know,
Mhm.
but it caused me to think about, considering that revenge is probably not the way to the most healthy state,
Mm.
it is surprisingly attractive to all of us. That's the crazy thing. We all dream of it. And that was just really interesting. So to me,
Mm.
that was very cool.
It's
Yeah.
such a
Maybe.
catharsis. I
Mm.
think that that's such an important thing to that it is a process of shedding the
Yeah.
rage, especially for a lot of women, shedding
Yeah.
the rage of the little things that just that if you let them add up, it just gets
Mm.
miserable after a while. So I think that that's the catharsis of allowing a vengeance to
Yeah.
happen
Mm.
that can create a transformation. Like
Yeah.
I didn't realize I was creating a changing of the guard story in my story. I didn't realize that the captain was going to kind of like change hands over the course of the story. And then I realized, oh, it's actualizing this newcomer into this situation, and this old hat can kind of like take break for a while.
Yeah.
We've been thinking about spectral revenge, like endless spectral revenge might get a little old for a time too. So I
Right.
think does the catharsis at a certain point serve its purpose, and can that be set down?
Well, it would have to, right? You know, it would have to, you know, it would, catharsis eventually has to come to an end.
Right.
You know, and what I love is the different voices. I mean, for instance, if you're me, if you're a middle-aged white man, your notions of revenge are pretty petty because the privileges that we enjoy are quite high. So the revenges tend to be based on, there was a really great movie back in the 80s called Falling Down. No, it was the early 90s, where it was
Michael
just about
Douglas.
this guy who's having a terrible day because he gets laid off. And, you know, and so I'm such a person of privilege that my thoughts of revenge would go towards these petty grievances that sort of build up. But at least if you grapple with that story and that person and that point of view, it can become a story that you can be interested in, like that one, where he ends up becoming the bad guy. But the great thing about having multiple voices is that you're not stuck with that. You're not stuck with a bunch of grumpy 50-year-old guys. You know, we've got us, but we've got other people. So that's what I love about, you know, the breadth of it all.
Mm.
So,
I
yeah.
love that. And I guess maybe that's why we need these stories, because you're right. Like, we can't have a flock of women donning severed capes and, vigilanting their way through the town, but maybe
Or
through
can
like,
we?
or can we? Yeah, it's on. No. But yeah, maybe you get that sense of
The reason
catharsis
we can't,
through
Melanie, is
stories.
because I don't know how to knit.
Dang it,
I
neither
know
do
that
I.
Melanie's cape is specifically knitted together, and that took me a moment. I was like,
You
it's
could
knitted.
use a sort of large laminating machine. I mean, you'd be surprised what you can put into acrylic, you know.
I love how you're all trying to facilitate the plan and make the cape happen. I actually have an artist. I've commissioned an artist to do an artwork of it. So one of the things she's like, I'm gonna have to work on how to make it look realistic, but not too graphic, the cape.
I mean, you know, Clive Barker, one of Clive Barker's greatest stories was called In the Hills, the Cities. And it's about these two towns that go to war with one another by creating enormous giants that they build out of their own bodies. They sort of stack one another atop one another, and then they move these giant creatures that are built out of hundreds and hundreds of people. He describes it, and yet it is impossible to really describe, and it is impossible to really envision quite how this would work. But you believe it in the story, you know, I'll never forget that. In the Hills of the Cities, that is just one of the most stunning visions ever. But yeah, okay. Well, I have kept all of you people way too long, and I'm so thankful for the time that you've spent. And I will get this video up, and I'll be sure and send it to you. And if you have any questions, if you run into anything out there and you just want advice, or you want to recommend somebody or anything, I always want to be open to authors and treat authors like I want to be treated. And Intra feels the same way. So please be a friend and reach out. And I consider you all my friends. You're all lovely, and I'll protect you. So have a fantastic evening, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Thanks. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jason.
You're the best.
Thanks, everybody. You're awesome.
Jason.